Hello everybody, I'm Sue Dyke. I'm an archaeological science student with University of Highlands and Islands based in Orkney. I'll be talking to you today about my dissertation project, and I'm only sorry that I can't be there in person. To that end, I'll leave my contact details at the end of the presentation, and I'd love to hear from anybody who's got any comments or any questions. I'd like to start by thanking Highland Archaeology Festival for the opportunity to present this project. It's a work that combines pollen analysis and historical research, and it's associated with post-medieval shieldings in Caithness. In the next 20 minutes, I'll talk about the aims and objectives of the project. I'll give some background and show how it fits with wider research frameworks. I'll give a brief history of shieldings and their place in post-medieval farming. I'll talk about pollen analysis and how I hope to use it, as well as the historical and archaeological resources I'm using. And I'll show how I hope to combine these different research methods. I've still got 6 months to go, so I'll finish with progress to date and what's coming next. The aim of the project is to investigate the post-medieval land use history and the economy of the shieling sites, and to find out what impact those activities had on the surrounding landscape at Braehour. I'm doing that by conducting a pollen analysis, and that will reveal changes in land use, economy, and their impact on the landscape. I'm also using archaeological and historical evidence to investigate periods of occupation and agricultural practices at the sites over time. Then I'll be comparing these different sets of data to see if they correlate or if they conflict, and why that might be. There's not too many studies combining these kinds of sources for shieldings, so I'll be looking to evaluate the effectiveness of the approach as well. So today the site is a Forestry Commission plantation. It's situated in northern Caithness, close to Braehour farm. And the peat core that I'm analysing was taken from a 1 kilometre wide peat basin. So that means that the pollen catchment will give a regional and not just a local pollen signal. So it should give information relating to the shieldings that you can see pictured here. In fact, there appears to have been a great deal of post-medieval activity in the surrounding landscape, and you can see that from this map. I created it in QGIS using the coordinates of everything that was listed in Canmore as post-medieval for the area. If you compare the activity and the weight of population in the landscape represented by that last map with this photo, you can see it contrasts starkly with how the landscape looks today. The shieling remains have mostly gone. They've largely been destroyed by forestation, or they've been lost to erosion because of their ephemeral nature. There are a few that remain in the area, and this is what they look like today. This screenshot from Heritage Path's website shows how the shieldings fit within the wider landscape. You can see that they're perfectly positioned between two medieval drove roads. The photo on the right is the current B870, and that now follows some of the route that's marked in red. This research ties in with the SCARF National Framework, and it aligns with some of the research recommendations by the medieval panel, such as combining paleoenvironmental studies with archaeological and historical documentary analyses. Periods of interest highlighted by the panel include the Little Ice Age, rural settlement and expansion, and then the subsequent contraction and abandonment. These all have the potential to be covered by the project. This work also ties in especially with the Regional Highland Archaeology Research Framework. It's only just recently been launched, just at the end of last month, and particularly with Chapter 10, which focuses on the post-medieval Highlands. Section 10.2 concerns environmental evidence, and it notes that most of the pollen analysis today actually covers the prehistoric period, and it's identifying a need for coverage of more modern periods, and of course that includes the post-medieval. The project connects with some of the existing framework research questions for the region, such as how did climate change through the period, what were the environmental impacts of different land management practices. But concerning the transport and movement research questions, Perhaps it could be useful to look at adding to these, to look at changes in transhumance and the use of drove roads across the period, and how they affect changes in the landscape and the routeways. One of the research recommendations highlights the need for more multi-proxy studies to give information on local climate, crops grown and shieling activity. So it might be that results from this project could be useful as a case study for the regional framework. The word shieling is thought to have an Old Scots, even Norse origin with Middle English variations, and there are quite a number of Gaelic words for these structures. They're seasonal dwellings that are often associated with transhumance activities, so the movement of livestock to summer pastures. It's been practiced as a form of pastoralism since animals were first domesticated, but in the Highlands and Islands, evidence is mostly from the 11th through to the end of the 19th centuries, and it ends with the expansion of sheep farming, although some sheilings remained until the mid-20th century, especially in the Outer Hebrides. They're relatively small and permanent structures. They're built from local materials. They're circular to oval, subrectangular in shape, and they're usually found in groups. Most of the historical and published literature emphasises the importance of dairying and cheese production and summer grazing on shieling economy. There's evidence of small-scale cultivation as well. This often arose because of the soil enrichment through the manuring of the livestock on the land. And many other activities are also known to have taken place, such as peat cutting, timber procurement, metalworking, and even distilling. These seem to have been different for different areas, so hopefully this research will identify some of the activities taking place at Braehour. The season varied between sheilings and regions anywhere from 4 to 10 weeks, and sometimes they eventually became permanent farmsteads. In short, they were integral to the old Highland economy. They gave the farming communities flexibility. Probably the largest body of research associated with sheilings to date is historical and documentary research. A detailed and comprehensive piece of work is the book by Albert Bill, which examines sheilings in the post-medieval period in the Central Highlands. There have been a number of pollen land use studies for the Highlands, some of them associated with sheilings, but specifically post-medieval Highland land use studies are much smaller in number. But some of those have sought to combine environmental with historical data, such as Davies 2016. That found pollen revealed details such as cereal cultivation that hadn't been evident in documentary sources. In fact, the pollen sequence was the only land use record at times that was accessible for those sheilings. There's been a palynological investigation of the Braehour area by Caithness 2020, looking at past woodlands to inform future conservation. This study uses that same peat core, but it's got a different focus and it will cover the post-medieval period specifically. There have been 2 field surveys done in the Braehour area, but no excavation. However, across Scotland there have been a number of shieling excavations, and they've included large projects like Lairg and Ben Lawyers, and they've used multiple research techniques that included environmental studies. Dixon 2020 sums up Scottish transhumance evidence to date and concludes that different studies are needed for different areas and that complementary pollen analysis should be done for all. So that fits nicely with the SCARF recommendations that I mentioned earlier. Pollen analysis is a technique used for reconstructing former vegetation and environments. Pollen grains are well preserved in waterlogged conditions. They've got different morphologies and surface patterns. You can see that from the bottom half of the picture. So that allows identification to family and to genus level. They're dispersed by wind, water, insects, but most of the fossil pollen is windborne. So the pollen rain gets laid down in peat or sediment in stratified sequences, so that when you take a vertical core sample through the peat, it gives a slice through time. Recording includes not just pollen, but non-pollen polymorphs, NPPs as well. They're microfossils of non-plant origin, such as fungal spores, algae, invertebrates. You can see some examples in the top half of the picture, and they act as paleo-environmental indicators. I'll also be recording microscopic charcoal. This informs of burning events, and they're often anthropogenic in nature. So putting all that together builds up a picture of changing landscape and activity in and interaction with it. The peat core I'm working on has already been taken by Jasmine Siebencher using a closed chambered Russian auger, which prevents contamination from the surrounding soil. Jasmine focused on the prehistoric portions of the core. She did subsample a portion I'll be looking at, but at 8 centimetre intervals. I've used the age depth curve she constructed to locate the post-medieval portion of the core, which lies at about 15 centimetres from the top and spans down to a depth of around 38 centimetres. And I've subsampled at 1 centimetre intervals to give a higher resolution analysis. The samples have been prepped to preserve them and stain the identifying features, and I'll do counts of 500 land pollen grains at each level, also noting any aquatic taxa, MPPs and charcoal. So finally I'll be able to input the data into Tilia software, and that'll produce a pollen diagram which will show changes over time like this. This is actually Jasmine's pollen diagram. Jasmine noted a sharp decline of what little was left of birch, alder and hazel in the 1700s, and saw the introduction of pine and spruce plantations in the late 1800s. Heather dominated at this time, and that signals drier conditions. Sedge peaks and possible cereal pollen hints at the start of cultivation around 1900. The cereal was mostly barley. Pollen from human indicator species such as plantain, sorrel, brassica also reflected people cultivating the landscape at the time. MPPs indicated wet eutrophic conditions and erosion, possibly caused by grazing, and later on MPPs also indicated possible drainage and moor burning, probably to enhance cultivation. I would expect that my results would follow the same broad trajectory, but I'm hoping that the higher resolution analysis will give a more detailed picture, and that might tie in with historical documentation for the area. 2 archaeological surveys have been done at Braehour. The field survey by Mercer in 1977 recorded 7 major groups of shielings comprising over 100 structures of differing morphologies. They were thought to be the result of many phases of construction. Mounds were common to all structures, likely the result of collapsed turf and roof walls, and all were of minimal size, the internal space no greater than 7 by 3 metres. So that was the size of the shieling that we measured out in the field. Peter Anna's walkover survey in 2012 noted the area had been deeply ploughed prior to woodland plantation, and that many of the 1977 sites could no longer be located. They'd been destroyed by the woodland plantation, and those that did survive were close to stream courses, as were the 2 examples that we discovered. Peter Anna noted 25 new sites, removed some duplicate entries from the database, and the result was a gazetteer that includes, amongst other entries, 62 post-medieval sites consisting of shielings, farmsteads, peat mounds, cuttings, banks, clearance cairns, tracks, enclosures, dykes, a pen and a bridge abutment. The historical sources I'm hoping to make use of for the project are many and they're varied. They include old maps. You can see from Roy's military survey for the area that indicates field systems. I'm hoping that's something that will show through in the pollen record for the same period. The old and new statistical accounts were created by Caithness estate owner John Sinclair of Ulster. He was known for his agricultural improvements. The old statistical account mentions extensive arable ground, pastures and meadows in abundance, as well as waste ground that was fit for improvement and bogs and marshes fit for pasture most of the year. Again, these are things that I should be able to track in the pollen record. The new statistical account reports an increase in population, and it puts it down to the cultivation of the waste ground. My historical research is at an early stage. The dissertation's still got 6 months to run, so there's plenty more resources that I'm hoping to make use of, including county agricultural reports, census returns, parish registers, estate papers, court records, and I'll be continuing to use sources in the national and the regional archives. I've been in touch with a number of the local heritage centres and organisations, Wick, Dunbeath, Timespan and Halkirk, and they've all been extremely helpful. I'd hoped also to contact the Clan Gun Heritage Centre, as guns have lived at Braehour since the 1500s, but I understand the centre's shut until April next year. So the pollen core has been subsampled, prepped, and I'm about to start the analysis, and then I'll be looking to see if it correlates with any of the archaeology and the historical documentation. The archaeology surveys give evidence of extensive post-medieval activity in the Braehour area. So will this show up in the pollen signal? Is there going to be an increase in the microscopic charcoal showing anthropogenic activity in the landscape? Will there be cereal pollen indicating arable crops? Will there be dung fungi pointing towards livestock present in the landscape? The historical documentation is going to be useful because it's dated, so I'll be looking to see if the arable, livestock or drainage activities that are reported show a corresponding pollen signal at a similar chronology in the pollen core. The historical source that's given the most specific and local information for Braehour so far has been the newspaper coverage throughout the 1800s. It charts a course of changing and eventually failing fortunes and consequent changes in land use and economy for the area. From rich arable and pasture land, then up for lease, then sheep farming and drainage, then a bankruptcy, then talk of a new road, and then at the end of the century a sale of the farm. Will the pollen record reflect any of this, or will the changes be too rapid to be picked up in the pollen signal? Overall, will the sources corroborate or contradict one another? Will they simply tell the same story? Or will the pollen, the archaeology and the historical sources each have something unique to say about the land use and the economy of the sheilings? So to recap, my aim is to investigate the land use history, economy and environmental impact of the post-medieval sheilings in the Braehour area. I'm doing that by combining pollen analysis with research of available historical and archaeological sources. I'll then be evaluating whether this is a useful approach. The project addresses gaps highlighted in both the national and the regional archaeological frameworks, which both recommend combining environmental analysis with historical investigation. Thank you for listening. I'd like to finish by thanking Highland Archaeology Festival once again for the opportunity to speak, and to thank everyone who's given their time and their expertise generously to help with the project. And I'd welcome any comments or questions via email. Thank you.